Yeah.
Just play devil's advocate just a bit.
Please.
I think there is an assumption in your presentation that nuclear weapons equals influence in international politics in the contemporary age, which I think is an assumption that you need to at least defend. I think if I really want to be flippant about it, I could say the way to resolve the problem is just make nuclear weapons a technical issue. So whether you're a rising power or not rising power, as long as your nuclear weapons come together and you resolve issues of vertical and horizontal proliferation, and deal with it, because someone could easily say, I'm not saying I agree with it, someone could easily say nuclear weapons are no longer the markers of international influence that they used to be.
Currency of power.
And in fact, for some of these states, it's just nuclear weapons have become an instrument to ensure survival. I guess in Pakistan's case, in the DR case. So, just wondering, how do you see that? Number two is, just quickly again, you did the presentation so well that it's going to be difficult for me to ask this question, but I'm going to ask you.
No, please. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You framed it quite cleverly as well. But norms, in a sense, are quite important, because you mentioned norms once when you're talking about how the three pillars.
Right.
But in a sense, especially in the case of state to state, I think we've come to a stage where international norms have built to a stage where using a nuclear weapon or by one state against the other becomes such a taboo that it's, I think, quite unthinkable. I mean, in the literature you've got a lot of people talk about how chemical weapons taboo, for example, how conventional chemical weapons have come to a stage where most people don't want to use it because the norm has become so strong. What do you think about the norm against using nuclear weapons? I know the problem, of course, is non-state actors. So it's quite hard for me to ask you that question, but you sort of covered it a bit. But I just want to push you a bit more on that. But thank you, very interesting.
Thank you. Should I start with this and then I can? Okay. Thank you very much for both of those excellent questions, really, and really detailed ones as well. So in terms of nuclear weapons no longer being the currency of power, right? I mean, this is an interesting parallel to draw with the economic sort of situation, right? What you do when a currency is losing its power, right? There's one of two things that you do. One is you devaluate, right? Have we seen a devaluation of nuclear weapon roles? In fact, what you're starting to see is a revaluation of their role. In a way that, increasingly the role of nuclear weapons is expanding, not contracting. Whereas in the past, it was very clear, nuclear weapons were only to deter other nuclear weapons, nothing else. But today, it's against other weapons of mass destruction. It's also against some chemical attacks and some terrorist attacks as well. So, there's a greater and greater diffusion of that as well. So that's one problematic. The second, the second way you deal with the currency devaluation is to say, right, this currency is not working. We bring out a new currency, right? Deutschmark, etc. I mean, you bring out a new standard, right? Gold standard, pound sterling, dollar, etc. That's not happening either. So you're in this very strange flux, where you're absolutely right, that there are some states which have an influence which has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and I would argue that probably holds true for India today, right? That if India did not have nuclear weapons, it would, still have a greater sort of influence. But let me flip that question around as well. Now, and it goes a little beyond Southern Asia, but let's go there, right? Today, there are some rising powers which are not nuclear weapon states. I have Brazil in mind. How do you think the nuclear order would react if tomorrow Brazil decided to go nuclear? I think there would be a tacit acceptance of that. Brazil. Sorry?
There are guys.
Precisely. And I think that's a key point. Why are they our guys? Why would the approach to Brazil be different than, say, North Korea, for example, right, or Iran, right? And I think that's the marker. So in some ways, it's the inability to move beyond this currency of nuclear weapons, which has made, nuclear weapons in a flux. And this brings me to the second sort of point that you raised, right? Which is to say that, again, I'm very agnostic in terms of the role of nuclear weapons, right? And I think they have played a particular role in managing major power relations, not because only nuclear weapons, but because of the institutions related to the nuclear weapons. So as long as you have nuclear weapons, you need those institutions to manage those nuclear weapons. I agree broadly that there is a taboo on the use of nuclear weapons. I would even go to the extent of conceding that that taboo holds vis-a-vis the major nuclear weapon states. Would that taboo hold vis-a-vis the non-major nuclear weapon states? Now, there you see a greater degree of, shall I say, risk-taking, right? Now, let's take another example, right? Under the nuclear umbrella, under the classic nuclear order, there was, again, one of the norms was that you certainly had proxy wars. Vietnam is a very good example. I mean, there were a number of them. You could also talk about Afghanistan in that sort of context, right? Which, of course, happened under nuclear conditions, right? But you never really had attacks on each other's homeland and soil, right? Given under the umbrella of nuclear attacks, and that you've already seen happen. And what is to say that a similar role is not likely to happen in the North Korean context or indeed in the Iranian context? So there, the question of norms, again, I'd agree would hold vis-a-vis the major powers, but I'm not so sure that they would hold necessarily the non-major powers. That's one sort of element. But the second aspect there is, you may also have, I wouldn't call it accidental, I'd probably call it more inadvertent, that there may be some scenarios in where tensions are rising, and we've seen, and this is where I link the element of tensions rising on the India-China border, and not at the moment to that extent in the South China Sea, although I know Rajamohan's written about that a lot, but under some circumstances, you can see that tensions might rise to a degree, of clashes, and perhaps, well, clashes have already happened on some of the borders, and maybe a potential conflict, but where are those conflicts going to be resolved? One possible arena is the G20, but the G20 is way too big. And, and there's already a big sort of concern of saying you don't want to diffuse this to look at other issues. Where is that conversation going to take place between China and India, for example, in a moment of crisis?
Surya, you wanted to?
Yeah, could you take us through what was really the secret of NPT being China-friendly ab initio, although China was seen to have been cavalier in its attitude even after PTBT was entered into. Secondly, in your presentation on muddling through as a possible situational reality today, why can't you think of China accommodating Pakistan the way US accommodated India in NSD? Why is it that kind of an unthinkable proposition?
Right. Okay. Again, excellent questions, and thank you very much for them. I don't know whether I know the NPT secret, in terms of whether, and we may have to wait for some more archives to open up. But I think, it's based on a couple of assumptions. Number one, soon after, in the run-up to the Chinese nuclear test, we know from US archives there was very serious thinking of trying to prevent China going nuclear, including the attempts of preemptive attacks, the kind that sort of Israel did on Osirak, right? And even after the Chinese nuclear test, there was very serious considerations in the US thinking to actually try and forcibly disarm China, right? But then when the NPT negotiations began, and as you know, it was largely the US and the Soviet Union which drove those negotiations, there seems to have been a change of position to try and accommodate China. Mind you, and this is interesting because this happened even though China and the Soviet Union already broken apart, that alliance had broken apart. The US-China alliance had not happened yet, but perhaps there was already an inkling of that, possibly, right? And the one key way that China was accommodated was this very interesting mechanism in the NPT of the date of the nuclear tests. The NPT remains unique that it is the only treaty which puts down a firm date. The PTPT did not put down a firm date, the partial test ban treaty, and neither is the comprehensive test ban treaty, separated by decades. And it is interesting that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty chose to go down the path of identifying a particular date as the cutoff, which is an interesting structure. So that's one sort of element of accommodation. Sure, of course, China may well want to try and accommodate Pakistan. And indeed, you know, I think if you look at this history of challenges from within the order, and you know, from also outside the order, Pakistan does pose a very particular dilemma because you know, Pakistan going nuclear was really facilitated not by one member of the existing nuclear order, China, but two, the United States as well. And you know, one could argue that there were times that the United States might have had it in its role to prevent emergence of a nuclear Pakistan. It chose not to do that for a variety of reasons, right? So that remains another sort of dilemma. Why we're now today, you know, confronted with the Pakistan sort of option. Coming to your question on the accommodation, certainly China would try and do that, but the accommodation would require Pakistan's participation at least in some of the pillars, and you know, and for me, when I've identified them, you've got to have the informal pillars are one of them, but the other is also, at least in my opinion, a reformed Security Council, right? Now, even if China was to try and accommodate Pakistan in the informal pillars, you know, all the export control regimes, first of all, it's not clear that China would get the consensus to do that within all of these regimes. Second, even if that was to happen, nobody, not even Pakistan, is presenting itself as a candidate for a reformed UN Security Council. So from that point of view, it's going to remain a limited kind of role or accommodation vis-a-vis Pakistan.
Thanks. Anybody else? There are no other questions. I wanted to raise a few things.
Please, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think one, I mean, you seem to give a bad name to muddling through, you know.
Right.
While that is the ultimate way in which,
right.
I mean, muddling through is real life, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is good policy. Yeah. Which, while you have this whole thing, look, there is a structure of arms control, treaties.
Mm-hmm.
In some senses, we are imputing meanings out there. I mean, I think it was never originally intended in that manner. If you go back to the 60s when the NPT was considered and debated, Kennedy first talked about 20 countries, 40 countries going nuclear. But if you look at the performance of the treaty, for all the thing you call about a disorder, it's interesting how the treaty has survived and has done reasonably well. That the purpose was not to freeze the global order, but to delay, to slow down the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I think if that is the objective and not defined in today reading the text back and creating a formal meaning to it, that the thing was to slow down. And if that was the case, I think you can say it was an eminently successful treaty in the sense that today you go back to 68 when the treaty came into 79, when the treaty was drafted. As you rightly said, China was against it. Even France was against it.
That's right. Yeah.
But by 92 you have reasonably all P5 are party to it. So in some senses, they've strengthened the treaty.
Right.
Two, that while the new challenges have come in terms of proliferation, you also have the system tried to modify the treaty without actually having to revise it formally. Article 3, which is about safeguards, has been tightened. Additional protocol and a range of new instrumentalities have come in. Article 4, which is supposed to be free access to nuclear technology, that is being restricted. To mention just few, that the system was capable of some self-correction. I mean, it is not, everyone has not followed it. So therefore, if you see it as a limited objective, then I think you've seen it's a reasonably, muddling through has reasonably been successful, and it has worked. The second question I wanted to raise was that one is the formal treaty language structure. There's NPT, there was CTBT, there's SALT, START, all this stuff. All this was doable because you created a set of security structures outside the treaty framework. That is, there would be no NPT without some sense of an American security guarantee to the West European states. That most West European states were in a position to produce nuclear weapons. They voluntarily eschewed that option because they were part of an alliance system where the potential nuclear threat from Russia was countered by the US commitment to extend the nuclear umbrella. So that is not written into the treaty, but that is the core foundation. And similarly in Asia, Japan took 7 years to ratify the treaty, and Japan didn't go nuclear because of the American alliance and American security guarantee. Now, that structure, what seems to be today disturbing the system, is not as much as the spread of new nuclear weapon states, but the weakening of the alliance structures, especially in Asia. In Russia, in Europe, there's no sense of threat today. Even if Ukraine falls apart, I mean, nobody's going to lose their sleep. But in Asia, the rise of China and the changes in the distribution of power within Asia, in fact, could be the biggest source of destabilization for the non-proliferation system or the so-called nuclear order, because the assumption of the alliances was the Soviet Union was the principal threat, and the American extended deterrence or nuclear umbrella will work as long as the threat from the Soviet Union. But today, with China as the dominant power, and the territorial disputes between China and Japan are playing themselves out. Now, if I were a Japanese, and I would say, look, is the American guarantee a credible one? Is an American alliance, will it work in the case of China? I mean, that's a big debate. I mean, some of it is subterranean, some of it is explicit. It's not that tomorrow the Japanese are going to make nuclear weapons, but the structure of the alliance system, which provided the buttress for the global nuclear order, that is breaking down in Asia. If there is no extended deterrence, what Japan will do, what Korea will do, what even Australia might do, under circumstances where it is clear the US is so interdependent with China that it will be incapable or unwilling to defend its allies in Asia, that I think is an explosive issue that is waiting, far more serious than what India and Pakistan do, what others do with each other. And therefore that regional balance, I think, is going to be the key one. And therefore, that's my last point when you say, look, it's not the regional issue, but the global issue. Look, I think Iran might have the rhetoric of a global nuclear discrimination, blah, blah, blah. We used to do the same thing till we got the weapons. But the real stuff is Iran is not going nuclear because the global order is discriminatory. It is afraid of the American power to use regime change. Therefore, they're going to go to do nuclear weapons. Just because you make the order equitable, that doesn't solve the security problem of Iran or North Korea. So for them, it is not a question of global nature. I'm not a great fan of norms, especially when hard security is involved. So this is not about global norms or global structure, but how a regime feels its security threatened, and therefore using the nuclear card to extract other political leverages, which are far more central than the nature of the nuclear order. So these are the issues.
Okay. Raj, thank you very much for those, because and in some ways, we're not differentiating very much or not disagreeing very much at all. I don't think I said I gave that muddling through is bad. It's just maybe I should use a more
No, it's
catchy
fine.
term, but you know, it's
Elegant muddling.
It's elegant muddling. I don't know, but it is indeed the only way that we're likely to see, you know, this sort of order evolve, because there's no other. I mean, I think in some ways formally we've reached the structure of the evolution of the NPT in whatever way, shape, or form you might sort of want to see. And the big challenge for the NPT regime broadly now is that many of the other believers have taken on to the norms and values rather than understanding the other sort of dimensions of the NPT. And so this again makes it a diminishing returns to try and keep preserving the NPT and try and use that kind of order. But I really do want to underline the point that you made, and I think this is exactly what I was also trying to highlight, and perhaps didn't come through as clearly, is the absence of formal structures in the Southern Asian context in particular, but Asia in general. The fact that you do not have the equivalent of a NATO or a Warsaw Pact in Asia.
You have the bilateral alliances.
Yeah, but to some extent, I mean, and the fact that maybe they don't go far enough, and perhaps there were limits there. So, for example, if you wanted to reimagine this scenario in some ways, right, one option might have been for the US to offer the nuclear umbrella to Pakistan. Now, it may have caused India some heartburn and problems in some ways, but another way, it would have sort of formed, been much more structured in some other sort of way. Some have argued that one of the reasons why North Korea went down that direction was also because it lost the umbrella that it ostensibly had from the Russians. So in some ways I agree, no, not in some ways, I totally agree with you. It's really the weakening of the alliance structure and the fact that you don't have any other kind of alliance structure to take its place. And the other one that I mentioned was the OSCE. What is the equivalent of the OSCE in Asia, where you can actually have these various countries sit together and work out some of their differences? You may not be able to work them out, and but it's partly a question, an issue of how do you manage, on one hand, the rise of China, on the other hand, how do you strengthen extended deterrence, right, in this kind of region? And in the absence of those institutions, it is going to be problematic. The question that comes to my mind is, where and how are we going to build these institutions? Where about, and who's going to take the lead on that? That poses a little bit of a challenge. Iran, I agree with in that sense. So
I think that's a good job.
Just throw in this. Does the Shanghai, whatever it's called,
Cooperation Organization
have any potential in relation to?
Right.
I know
Right.
this is way out of my terrain.
Right. No,
But it's
not
just
at all.
something that
Not at
There's
all.
nothing secret there, so it is not much is happening. So.
Right. So there are three potential institutions, which exist in this kind of area, right? One of them is SARC. Nobody's holding their breath to see SARC form a kind of a no-war, arrangement in South Asia. No one, right? The second is ASEAN. ASEAN, frankly, I think the downside is the absence of nuclear weapons and the ability to, ASEAN can play a very good broker, right? And it's done a very good job, very fundamental job by bringing people together under the ARF, but that reaches its limits, right? Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one which may have some potential, but the fact that it was primarily driven by China, is largely likely to be dominated by China, I think puts limitations on it. Look at, for example, the approach of even India and Pakistan coming on board as observers. There's a very interesting sort of play there, and I don't think that may necessarily be the obvious sort of player going forward. So I'm not very optimistic about it, unfortunately.
Thanks. I think we already overshot by 5
Apologies,
minutes.
yeah.
No, we're going to bring this to a close, and I really wanted to thank Dr. Sidhu for coming and giving us this talk on the nuclear disorder. My sense is that much the the framing, the theology, the terminology that was developed largely was built around the European balance of power issues after the Second World War. A lot of that is going to be, I think, largely irrelevant if the current dynamic in the US-China relationship and the Asian balance of power alters radically in the coming years. I think there'll be much learning for the nuclear order to do because it has to catch up with the most important geopolitical factor of our time, the rise of China, and how the rest of Asia is going to react to that. And to understand this, I mean, I don't think the past is going to be a guide to the future in that sense.
Right.
And therefore, it's going to be an exciting thing in terms of how would the nuclear order work itself out, both in terms of how the US-China nuclear equation work itself out. Because though the Obama administration has taken us back to all the mumbo jumbo of the Cold War, which is disarmament, CTBT, FMCT, but those are largely irrelevant to the debate in Asia. So therefore, the question is, how does the US-China balance play out in the nuclear field, and how does it intersect with missile defense, what is it, air-sea battle doctrine, the question of cyber, how these are going to play out is going to be far more consequential, I think. The second is, what does Korea do, what does Japan do, and how does India relate to this, I think is going to be far more interesting for this region. But I think, thank you for at least opening this debate, and we hope that since you're moving to Delhi from New York, you'll have more occasions to come by to Singapore and to visit the Institute of South Asian Studies. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.